We are fortunate to have with us today a courageous scholar who asks these important questions in a clear, logical, and dispassionate tone. Please join me in welcoming David Ray Griffin.
Thank you. I was just going to ask if you want to stand up for 15 seconds and have your opportunity. Well, I'm pleased to be able to say, Paul, I've actually finished the book now, so it should be out in about 6 weeks, I hope. With regard to our topic today, truth in politics, some people may wonder, people maybe outside this room, but is there anything in the 9/11 Commission report that is untrue? And now that I've finished the book, my big question is, can I find a true sentence in the book? That may sound extreme, but if you don't take it too literally, and if you realize a sentence is a part of a paragraph, which is a part of the argument, then it is hard to find any truth there. And so what I'm going to do this afternoon is just go through and give you some examples. But to get an idea of my audience, how many people here have read some of the 9/11 Commission report? About half of you. Very good. And now also let me ask, and no grading on this, no going to purgatory, but how many have read some of my book, at least? Oh, wow. Great, okay. Yeah. The group gets an A. One thing to understand about the report is that, we quite often name commissions after the leader. So we had the Rumsfeld Commission on the space program, so on. So quite often this is called the Kane Commission. But it should be called the Kane-Zelikow Commission, because the executive director is Philip Zelikow. He was a member of the Bush 1 administration. He got to know Condoleezza Rice very well there. They both served on the National Security Council. When they were between administrations during the Clinton years, they wrote a book together. When the Bush 2 administration was coming into power, she brought him on to help with the transition. And then he was appointed to the Foreign Advisory Board so he is essentially a member of the Bush White House. And yet, as executive director, he ran the commission. He had a staff of 70-some. He assigned them which topics were worth looking into and which ones were not. He assigned when people would come and say, I want to testify to the commission, I have something important to say. He would decide who would take that testimony, and so on. Let me give you an example, just one tiny example of how important that is. There's a new book out by Peter Lance called Cover Up. And Peter, good patriot that he is, went to testify because he had some important information about Ramzi Yousef. Remember who masterminded the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. He was also the mastermind of the Bojinka project that they discovered in Manila. And he also was the one who came up with the planes idea of using planes for weapons. So he is the mastermind. Peter went to give testimony. And his testimony was going to contradict some of the things that showed up that were in the prosecution's case in 1996 when they prosecuted Ramzi Yousef. Who took Peter Lance's testimony? Dietrich Schnell, one of the two prosecutors of that event, of that trial. So that is an example of how the executive director could skew. And Peter said he got a mole inside the commission, somebody who was very unhappy on the staff, who was unhappy with the way things were going. And they would meet, and he would tell Peter what was going on. And he said that Zelikow just runs the whole commission, that there are these leadership teams, and 6 out of the 7 teams, he said, are completely controlled by Zelikow. Only one team, run by John Farmer, was not, and they were butting heads all the time. There are other examples, like at the commission report, people would say, "Tell us about the war games." And they would ask the commissioners, "Why didn't you deal with the war games?" And the commissioners said, "Oh, we were told that was unimportant." Well, by whom were they told? So you essentially have the 9/11 Commission. It's the White House investigating itself. And furthermore, as Peter points out, the staff, you think, oh, they got a staff there. It's a bunch of people who know how to do research. They probably got, university students and so on. No. Ex-FBI, ex-CIA, ex-Department of Justice, 9 members from the Department of Justice. Ashcroft, So they've got their friends back on there. So when you wonder, why are no names named? Got people on there protecting their friends, protecting their institutions that they're still proud of, or they want to have the public to have a good point. So, from the very beginning, this was a doomed commission. It was not a commission to get the truth. Once you realize that, these things won't shock you quite as much. But even then, even knowing that, I was still shocked at the number of omissions and the audacity of some of the distortions. So let me go through some of these. Starting right out on the very first pages, they start telling you about the hijackers. What they don't tell you, and they give you the names, and in the middle of the book you can see their pictures. What they don't tell you is that at least six of those men are still alive. Some of them have, like Walid al-Shira, walked into the embassy and said, "Here I am, I'm not dead." Nevertheless, and some of them were interviewed by the BBC and London newspapers. And nevertheless, they're in there. And this Walid al-Shira, they have him on Flight 11, and they say, "We believe he's one of the ones who stabbed some of the people who were stabbed." Just a total disregard of well-known facts. Just omit that there's any problem with the identity of the hijackers. Likewise, they fail to mention, Daniel Hopsicker has written a whole book about Muhammad Atta, showing he was not a devout Muslim. The image we have, here are these radical fundamentalist Muslims, they're ready to meet their maker. Atta loved alcohol, pork, and prostitutes. And the commission says, we're puzzled. Why did these guys go to Las Vegas? We've not found any credible reason. Well, they loved lap dances, Another alleged hijacker is Hani Hanjour. And they tell us he was chosen to fly Flight 77, the one that was going to hit the Pentagon, because he was their best pilot. Hani Hanjour could not fly any kind of airplane. He would go up in his lessons, and the next time the guy wouldn't go up with him. He says, "You can't fly." He was known as a horrible pilot, even with a little plane. And yet he was alleged to fly this Boeing 757 and make this amazing spiral, come down and come in at ground level, 400 miles an hour into the Pentagon. The best pilots in the world, some of them have looked at that and said, "I don't think I could do that." Hani Hanjour could not fly. This one they do mention. It's a funny thing. They mention this and then they just ignore it. And they have President Bush amazed, boy, this was just some pilot, The flight manifest. We've never publicly seen flight manifests that show that any of the... So it's not just the 6. We don't know that any of the 19 men named were actually on these flights. None of this is mentioned. It's not mentioned and refuted. It's just not mentioned. So that's why I call it omissions. And some people call it the 9/11 Omission Commission. Let me give another example. The World Trade Center. They hardly discuss the question of these enormous buildings coming down. They don't discuss any of the problems. One problem is, never before in history have steel-framed high-rise buildings collapsed because of fire. Now, some people say, well, it wasn't just fire, these big planes hit them. Well, people who've looked at this said that's insignificant. Besides, no plane hit building number 7, which is a 47-story skyscraper, and it came down also. Furthermore, even if you were going to have fire weaken a building, it would have to be enormous fires. They would have to be very hot, not ordinary hydrocarbon fires that you get from kerosene, which is what jet fuel is. And they would have to be very long-lasting. These fires didn't last. The South Tower came down in 57 minutes. There's an enormous amount of steel in a 110-story building that is steel-framed inside and outside. And yet they're telling us these. Now, the only thing they mention here, they mention that South Tower collapsed in 10 seconds. Can you imagine how fire would bring down a 110-story building in free fall speed? And that's what it is. Also, the wrong tower collapsed first. The North Tower was hit first. And so if it's fire that's bringing it down, it takes a while for the fire to heat up the steel. So the North Tower should have collapsed first. The South Tower also had a much smaller fire because the plane hit it at the angle, at the corner, and so most of the fuel went outside and burned up. So that enormous fireball you see, you say, boy, what an enormous fire. Well, yeah, for about 15 seconds. And it's burned up, and so there's not much fuel to keep the fire going in the South Tower. And yet it collapses within 57 minutes. One of the places where you just know they're absolutely lying and cheating is they give you an account that makes it sound plausible that these towers could have come down. They tell you that in the core of each building was a hollow shaft that was just filled with elevators and staircases. Yeah, and 47 massive steel columns. That's what the World Trade, these buildings were all about. This was this unique structure at the time. These 47 massive steel things going up into the air. So massive at the bottom. So even if you accepted the official theory, which is a pancake theory, that somehow the connectors between the columns in the middle and then the peripheral beams around the building, somehow those snapped and then the floors came down and that floor was so heavy it hit the net and it just going down. Can you imagine that happening in 10 seconds? And even if it did, it's just like if in the old records, when the records fell on the spindle, and those of you who are old enough to remember those, the spindle's still there. So why aren't those 47 towers still sticking up in the air? But the pictures show they totally collapse. You have something that's no more than 3 stories high. You should have had... I mean, just total dishonesty to deny the existence of those massive columns. And then they don't even mention that building number 7 collapsed. There's not a word about it. Everybody admits there is no explanation for why building number 7 collapsed. In most cities, this would have been the biggest building, 47 stories high. It can be ignored only because it was next to the towers. And FEMA says they come up with this lame explanation of how this building came down. They said the only explanation we can come up with has a very low probability of occurrence. So that there's no answer. So rather than telling you like an honest report would, we're surprised, we're puzzled why building number 7 collapsed. There's no good answer. They just don't even mention that it collapsed. They don't tell you that Larry Silverstein, the owner virtually of the building and the builder of it, said on a PBS report, well, at a certain point, the fire chief and I got together and we said, you know, there's been so much loss of life, let's not take any chances, and we decided to pull it.
Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. and they made that decision to pull.
Pull it is the slang for bringing it down by controlled demolition. So he admits it in public. It's well known. It's mentioned in any, like my book and other books and all the books that people sent to the commission, assuming they wanted to know the truth. And they don't bring in Larry Silverstein and say, "Why did you say that? What do you mean by that? Isn't that what a commission looking for the truth might do?" Likewise, Giuliani said, "We knew that the towers were going to collapse, so we got the people out of building number 7. How did he know the tower? Buildings have never collapsed before in history. How could have he known the Twin Towers were going to collapse? They didn't ask him that. They treated him as a hero when he comes into the commission. They fell all over themselves, praising Rudy Giuliani as the great hero. So what I'm getting at here, those of you who haven't read it, is that all 3 collapses were pretty close to classic examples of what they call controlled demolition. When dynamite or some kind of explosives are placed throughout the building at all the crucial points, and then they put them on a computer and they bring them down in a certain order, and therefore the building comes straight down so it doesn't fall on these other buildings, and they come down in virtually free fall speed. And that's what happened here. All 3 buildings. You can see them on all sorts of places on the website. You don't see them on TV anymore. They showed them the first night, and Dan Rather, bless his soul, comes right out and blurts out the truth. He says, "Boy, that looks just like controlled demolition." The 9/11 Commission also does not tell you that Marvin Bush, the president's brother, and their cousin, Wirt Walker, were the principals of the company that was in charge of security for the World Trade Center. They don't... all sorts of coincidences here. They also don't tell you that there were many reports of people who worked in the building saying, we got a shutdown order, so for 3 days we couldn't go in the World Trade Center. There were engineers coming in and out. We didn't know what. Okay, moving right along to the Pentagon. They don't tell you that, they do mention that it was the west wing of the Pentagon that was hit. They don't mention that for terrorists who wanted to really strike a blow at the Pentagon, the west wing was the least likely part to hit. Why? Because all the big brass are in the east wing. That's where Rumsfeld and all the top generals are. Furthermore, the west wing was being renovated. So it was reinforced so the fire wouldn't spread to the rest of the building. Also, there were very few people there. And so, although it's tragic that 125 people on the ground were killed, several thousand would have been killed if the plane had hit any other. Well, if it had been a plane, we'll come to that later. But even what it was, it would have killed several hundred and maybe thousand if it had been an ordinary place. And also, terrorists would want to kill Pentagon workers. Most of the people killed were civilians who were there working on the renovation. Furthermore, as I said, it was the hardest place of the Pentagon to hit. You've got this huge Pentagon here with acres. All you had to do was fly right into the ceiling, right into the roof, and you would have done, you couldn't have missed. Even Hani Hanjour could have hit it. And all you had to do was hit the east wing. And, remember how smart these terrorists were? These were masterminds. And yet they didn't know that the west wing wasn't where you would want to hit. Furthermore, the facade, even though it was hit by a Boeing 750, this is official story, Boeing 757 going 400 miles an hour, got a wingspan of 125 feet, got these enormous engines on it, got a tail that makes the plane 40 feet high. It didn't knock the facade down for a half hour. The facade stood after being hit by the plane for a half hour before it fell down. Photographs were taken by Marines and other military people and Tom Horan of the Associated Press And they show you that the hole that was created by this Boeing 757 was about 20 feet in diameter. 20 feet in diameter. That's big enough to get the nose of a Boeing inside. So, there ought to be a Boeing sitting out there in front. Tom Horan's pictures, other pictures show there's no Boeing. This French researcher, Thierry Masson, has a website called Hunt the Boeing. And he shows all these photographs. They look outside, no Boeing. Well, let's go inside. No Boeing. So they asked Ed Plower, the fire chief, who was in charge of putting out. What'd you see in there, Ed? This was at the Pentagon press conference the next day. He obviously hadn't been coached, and he said, no big pieces of anything, no fuselage, no, nothing like that. And then two other people get up. One of them was the head of the renovation project and said, yeah, no big pieces of anything, nothing sticking up in the air. A Boeing 757 is pretty big. Why don't they just release the videos and show us? You know, there's cameras there, cameras on hotels next door. There's a camera in the gas station across the street. All you have to do is show us the videos and you can prove it was a Boeing 757. No, they didn't show us any. They finally, after Thierry Masson came out with his theory that it wasn't a Boeing but a missile, they released 5 frames that they said proved it. Some people have looked at those frames and said, that's when I became a skeptic, because that was not a Boeing, even though they tried to make it look like it. Furthermore, this video that was across the street, within 5 minutes of the attack, the FBI was over there and confiscated it. You would think the FBI would be distraught. Hey, for the first time in history, the Pentagon has been hit. No, they had the presence of mind to get in their cars and drive over there and confiscate the video. We've never seen it. 9/11 Commission, of course, doesn't mention any of this. How could a Boeing, a commercial airliner, attack the Pentagon? Wouldn't you have batteries of missiles surrounding the Pentagon so that any airplane that doesn't have a military transponder radiating friendly would be shot down? Of course, that's exactly the situation. And yet whatever it was that hit the Pentagon goes right through. Batteries are not operative. Then one of the most dishonest things in the Commission report is they actually bring this up. Because one of the criticisms have been these flights that were going to New York, they passed by one of the biggest nuclear plants right along the river there. All they had to do was attack that. That would have caused far more devastation than any of these attacks on the World Trade Center. It would have, killed hundreds of thousands of people, poisoned the area, ruined the economy of the United States, if that's what these terrorists wanted to do, because they hate freedom and democracy. But they didn't. They flew right over it and went and hit the World Trade Center. So what does the 9/11 Commission tell you? Well, they have this guy named, they call him KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And they've captured him, they tell us. Well, he's this font of information. And they just say anything they want to, and they say, this is what KSM told us. We have no way of checking this. They just tell us, he was the mastermind. So what he told them was, well, yeah, we thought about hitting a nuclear plant, but, we said, they're probably guarded. They probably have missiles around there. We'd probably get shot down. So let's go hit the Pentagon. It's surely... And I hate to say it, I'm not making this up. So when you hear that this report is the #1 bestseller of the year, and also you go on Amazon and look at the reports, the ratings, customer ratings, at least the last time I looked, 9 out of 10 were 5 stars. People are saying, now we know the truth. And yet this is comic book stuff. When you know what the truth is, you know all these other reports that they've ignored. It's almost comic book writing. Just, no, that's not true. This is true. How do we know it? Well, because KSM told us, or because we have this transcript. But of course, it will be put in the vault for 50 years, and you'll never be able to see it. With the Warren Commission, they published all the supporting documents. Whatever you can say about the Warren Commission, you can say a lot about the Warren Commission. You know, and Max Cleland said, I'm not going to be part of another Warren Commission cover-up. And he wasn't. The president got him a job, another job. And so you got Max Cleland off the commission, and so you got a unified report. They're very proud. We published this without dissent. They just give you all these reports, and yet they in the notes in the back, and these are authoritative, and yet there's nothing that you can go to check these reports because they're in the hands of the FBI or they're in the hands of other people. You can't check out anything they say, unlike the Warren Commission. At least you could see the testimony. Okay, President Bush on 9/11. You would think, you know, we've seen these movies about the Secret Service. These guys are really highly trained. And if there's the slightest danger to the president, they get in front of him. If there's the slightest danger that this route is not good, you change the route, and so on and so on. Here's the president down in Sarasota in the classroom. And, of course, a lot of you have seen that in the Michael Moore movie. And he sits there, and he sits there, and he sits there after they've told him about the second tower. After the first tower was hit, he says, oh boy, what a horrible accident. So they just go on like, oh, this is a little plane and it flew in. But after the second one, there could be no doubt, but America was under a terrorist attack. I mean, given the official story. Could be no doubt about that. So why didn't the Secret Service whisk him out of there? Because if these were terrorists and they wanted to attack the symbols of America, what better target than the President of the United States? If Osama bin... I started to say I'm not trying to put ideas in your mind, and I see I don't have to. Yeah. So the Secret Service would have immediately said, we're next. We're going to be targeted next. They're there in an empty school. There's no fighter cover over. The president is completely unprotected. So the 9/11 Commission said, well, we asked the Secret Service, why did you let the president stay there another half hour? And they said, well, we thought it would look bad if we got up and ran out of the room. Yeah, well, it would look bad if the President of the United States got murdered on your watch because you didn't do your job, too. But that, and they accepted that. And like the only alternatives were get him up and rush him out of the room, like Cheney said they did to him. Could it be that they think Cheney's more important than Bush? No. Let's not go there. The story about Cheney is probably apocryphal anyway. So, but that's what the Secret Service is supposed to do when there's a real danger. And yet, there was no sign of danger. So they said, well, we didn't want to rush him out of the room. So they left him there for 30 minutes. How about something in between, like, excuse us, the president must leave, he's been called to other duties, and you walk out of the room. So the commission didn't press them on that. They just accepted that answer. And time again, I use that as an illustration, they accept the most, really the silliest answers from these authoritative figures, and very seldom do they press. And the few times they do press, it gets deleted from the final report. And that's the other thing to know about Zelikow. He was the editor. He was in charge of the final report. And so it's pretty consistent. I've only found 2 or 3 inconsistencies in the parts of the book that I've read. So it clearly had to be finally one mind who was in charge of this. And he's my candidate. Advance warnings. No mention of the fact that Willie Brown was warned not to fly on an airplane that day. No discussion of why Ashcroft quit flying commercial planes suddenly. No mention that David Shippers, you remember who David Shippers? He prosecuted President Clinton. You'd think he'd be very popular in Republican circles. And so if David Shippers called up Attorney General Ashcroft and says, hey, I've got a serious problem here. I've got some FBI agents who tell me there's going to be an attack on Lower Manhattan. and Ashcroft will not return his call. Week after week after week, shippers tries repeatedly. These FBI agents, they said we knew over a month ahead of time the target and the date. Were they interviewed by the 9/11 Commission? Let's see if these guys are reputable. Let's put them under lie detector tests. No mention whatsoever. The National Security Agency tells us that they intercepted this message from KSM to Muhammad Atta on September 10th, giving him the go-ahead to do the plane's operation. But they said we didn't get around to translating it until September 12th, so of course we didn't know. Wouldn't you think maybe you would put somebody under a lie detector test and say, did you really not translate that? No mention of that. The put options. For those of you who don't know, to buy a put option, you're betting that a company's stock value is going to plummet. And if you buy at the right time and then it goes way down, and you buy a lot of that stock, you can make millions, tens of millions of dollars. So an enormous number of put options were purchased on American Airlines, United Airlines, and Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, which had 22 floors of the World Trade Center. Just the 3 or 4 days prior to 9/11. So first of all, the CIA monitors this stuff. So if they're going to say, no advance warning, here's the clearest sign in the world that United and American Airlines are going to be used to attack the World Trade Center. What could be clearer? They don't discuss that. All they say is, well, there's been a lot of hullabaloo about the put options, but we checked it out, and we found that this was not advance knowledge, because, and that's the accusation, of course, that it was insider trading, and somebody had advance knowledge. And they say, no, because we found the agency that bought 95% of the United Airlines share, and it was somebody who had no conceivable connection to Al-Qaeda. So you see the circular argument. The official story is that the commission started with and ended with is that the operation was pulled off entirely by Al-Qaeda and that nobody else knew about it. And so if this guy didn't have a pipeline to Al-Qaeda, he couldn't have possibly, it was just a lucky guess. Osama bin Laden. There were good, strong reports by Lefebvre, the Swiss journalist, that in July of 2001, Osama bin Laden, who was known as, he was the black sheep, he had been disowned by his own people and his own family and the royal family, and he was the number one wanted in the world. There was a, what was it, $10 million reward or whatever it was prior to 9/11, but he was the number one person wanted in the world. Lefebvre says he stayed in because of his kidney problems, he went to the American hospital in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, and was treated by an American doctor, and was visited by the local CIA agent, visited by the Saudi equivalent, and members of the royal family. No mention of this in the 9/11 report. Do not mention that the bin Laden family got together for weddings, where Osama and all these people who had disowned him got together. They do not mention that the British press decided that the whole hunt for Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan was a charade. Remember this, when he was in the Tora Bora Mountains and we were bombing this road, and yet somehow he escaped into Pakistan? They didn't tell us that, well, there were two roads and we only bombed one road and they went the other road. And then you heard Kerry the other night pointing out that said we outsourced this job too. So rather than the U.S. military going after bin Laden, no, we put it under the locals. Well, the locals were probably in, So, they don't tell you about this story about Gerald Posner tells in his book. He's otherwise very orthodox about 9/11. It's called Why Americans Slept. He says that this guy, Abu Zubaydah, who was one of the top 3 or 4 Al-Qaeda people in the world who was captured, then he was put under interrogation by CIA guys pretending to be, because they were Arabs, pretending to be from Saudi Arabia. So he says, oh great, my own countrymen, let me tell you, just call these, he had these numbers from memory, he said, call these members of the royal family, and they'll tell you, I'm the go-between between the royal family and Al-Qaeda. And they know all about this, so, be fine. And the CIA agent said, not after 9/11 it won't, because now all bets are off. They said, oh, no, they knew ahead of time. They knew there were going to be attacks on 9/11. It's no surprise to them. No mention of this. Now, Posner's story may be false. He may be an opportunist, and some people think he's just a lying person. And but no mention of it, even to refute it. Which you would think, and remember in the first, those of you who read the book, read in the preface, it said, our intention was to give the fullest possible account of the events surrounding 9/11. Well, this would be part of the fullest possible account. No mention of Saudi funding of Al-Qaeda. Now, some of you maybe have read Bob Graham's book. He reports that the 9/11 joint inquiry that the House and Senate Intelligence Committees did in 2003. And remember the 28 blocked out pages? That was about, he says here in the book clearly, that this was about Saudi government, and particularly about Saudi government funding of Al-Qaeda. No mention of this in the report except a disclaimer, this mantra they have, we have found no evidence. They say, we have found no evidence that any foreign government, we have found no evidence that the Saudi government or any members of the royal family gave money to Al-Qaeda. Now, Craig Unger, in his book, have you read House of Bush, House of Saud? This is the book that a lot of Michael Moore's movie was based on. And Unger reports that there's no doubt about that Prince Bandar, who is, in tight with the Bush family, even known as Bandar Bush. He's the Saudi ambassador to Washington. That he and his wife, particularly his wife, Princess Haifa, gave about $130,000 to a couple in California, San Diego, allegedly for a thyroid problem for the wife. And maybe she did have a thyroid problem, and maybe it was all innocent. But nevertheless, the money then went from that family to 2 of the alleged hijackers, Almedar and the other that was in San Diego. And so this is documented both by Graham and by Unger. And yet they said, we found no evidence that Princess Haifa gave any money, whether directly or indirectly, whether intentionally or unintentionally. She just didn't give any, period. Or that is, we found no evidence that she gave any. That statement could be literally true. You can't find sometimes what you don't look for. Saudi flights. Remember, this was the big to-do about Michael Moore's book, and people came out and said, oh, that's just gross distortion, that there were any unauthorized flights that were carrying Saudis. The 9/11 Commission says, yeah, no problem, nothing unusual went on. Craig Unger reported that on September 13th, there was a flight from Tampa to Lexington that carried 3 young Saudis to Lexington, where one of the big flights was going to take them out of the country. On the morning of September 13th, Craig Unger is very clear about this, at 11 o'clock, Commercial flights were allowed. Private planes were still not allowed. In fact, there was any pilots here, you know, about a NOTAM, is that what they call it? Notice to all airmen, using the old sexist language. They came out at 10:57 saying, warning, airspace is only open for commercial flights. No private flights will be allowed. You will be forced down if you go up. The 9/11 Commission just says, no problem. American airspace was open at 11 o'clock on that day, and that flight didn't leave until 4:30 in the afternoon. That is the complete, you know, one of the strongest examples of the complete dishonesty. They have to know they're lying. And yet, they also know that most of the American people won't know any better, and so they'll get 5-star reviews on Amazon.com in spite of such things. FBI. There are so many stories about FBI obstruction of investigations and so on. One of these, the most famous one, is by Coleen Rowley. Remember, she was one of the Time Persons of the Year because she blew the whistle on this sabotage, she said, within the FBI headquarters, that they wanted to get into Moussaoui's laptop computer because they thought he was going to fly planes into the World Trade Center. So they applied for a FISA, F-I-S-A, permit to investigate. They knew FISA would give it to them. They've hardly ever turned down an application in history. So what does somebody in headquarters do? He sabotages it. He takes out the crucial information that shows that what the French authorities had shown, that Moussaoui had a connection to Al-Qaeda rebels in Chechnya. He deletes that and then sends it to the superior to him, and the superior looks at it and says, this won't fly, I won't even send it to FISA. That's sabotage, and Coleen Rowley then exposed it. You will find Coleen Rowley's name once in the book, but no reference at all to this flap, which was important enough to get her on the cover of Time magazine. That's an extreme example of omission. Likewise, many of you know the saga of Sibel Edmonds, who was propositioned by a fellow Turkish woman, and they were hired to do translations after 9/11. She found this woman was working for one of the foreign groups that they were supposed to be investigating. This woman was either not translating the materials or mistranslating it. That she and one of her superiors were smuggling materials out of the FBI and giving them to this organization. Sibel Edmonds testified for 3.5 hours to the commission, told them about all of this, told them that her colleague, Behruz, was participating in a message from Iran. They had an asset in Iran who told them prior to 9/11 that Osama bin Laden was planning to attack the United States. And they were told to shut up, just keep quiet about it. Behruz went in and testified for 2 hours, and you can be sure he told about all this. His name is not even mentioned in the 9/11 report. Her name is mentioned once in a note in which it says she was one of 4 people who recommended that the FBI should tighten up its procedures. Pakistan and the ISI. The ISI is Intelligence Services, and it was set up by the CIA. And you see, if there were evidence then that the ISI were involved in 9/11, that might suggest that the CIA was involved in 9/11. So it'd be very important to keep any such information away. Well, Mahmoud Ahmed, the head of the ISI, how many of you know this, was in Washington the week prior to 9/11, meeting with George Tenet, head of CIA. No mention of this. They mentioned that he showed up on the 13th, probably to come over and give condolences and say, what can I do to help? But there's no mention that he was there prior to 9/11. There's no mention that he and Tenet were meeting 5 days before the leader of the Northern Alliance, Masood Ahmad, was assassinated, and according to the Northern Alliance, by the ISI. And that made things easy then when we went in there, because there were no leaders to challenge what the American government wanted to put in place. Then word came from India that this same chief of the head of the ISI had ordered another ISI agent to wire $100,000 to Muhammad Atta shortly before 9/11. So here you have the ISI up to its eyeballs in 9/11 planning. Not a single mention of any of this. And it shows the other, they said, we found no evidence of any foreign government funding. And of course, when you get to the back of the book, what are the recommendations? Continued cooperation and funding of Pakistan, and of course, continued cooperation with Saudi Arabia. So in other words, you start with the back of the book and look at the recommendations, and then you can figure out what they're going to discover was the truth about 9/11. In other words, this was all, to get to our topic, this was not truth-driven. This was politics-driven. The whole report is politically driven, not driven by a desire for truth. No mention of the fact that Daniel Pearl, Wall Street Journal reporter, was murdered by ISI. No mention that this other guy that Posner says that Abu fingered, as somebody in Pakistan who knew about 9/11 ahead of time, also died. Oh, I forgot to tell you about Posner's story. He mentioned 3 members of the royal family who were the ones who knew about him and knew about 9/11. All 3 of them die within an 8-day period. And that was, according to Posner and Unger, just after the CIA had told Saudi intelligence about these 3 guys. So Prince Ahmed, who's 41 years old, suddenly dies of a heart attack. The second guy dies the next day in a single car accident on his way to Ahmed's funeral. And then my favorite is that the young guy, who was only 21, died of thirst. He went out into the desert, and just being 21 years old, he probably just forgot, in the desert you need water. And no mention of any of these anomalies in the 9/11 report, as if, gee, this is something strange we should look into. Okay. So the same thing happened in Pakistan then. This Mir died in one of these flights, even though the plane had just been checked. Of course, that was probably the problem. It had just been checked. Yeah. No mention that another ISI agent in 1999 had looked at the World Trade Center. He was being taped and said, those towers are coming down. So this is a long-term plan, if that story is true. No mention in there about all the motives. If you're going to say, well, maybe the U.S. government was involved, you'd say, well, why? You need a motive. Cui bono? Who benefits? No mention of the fact that the United States government had a big appetite and big plans. So why did we attack Iraq? Let's go to Afghanistan. Well, we were concerned about peace and human rights. Now, if you read any of the books, it's all about the pipeline wars, to put in the gas and oil pipelines to bring down gas from the Caspian Sea, which may be the 3rd largest oil and gas reserves in the world, and be able to bring them down through Pakistan and Afghanistan so they don't have to go through Iran or Russia. And UNICAL was leading the consortium to do this. So read Rashid's book on the Taliban. It tells all about that. It has 2 chapters about romancing the Taliban, how we were working with the Taliban to try to bring this off. No mention of that. No mention that the 3 people who were in charge of our defenses on 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld, General Myers, he was in charge coincidentally just because Henry Shelton had to go to Europe. So Myers was in charge. And Eberhard, who was the head of NORAD, So they were the three in charge of our defenses. Those are the three biggest supporters of the U.S. Space Command, which we heard about in the song. The Space Command is the big deal. It's weaponizing space for absolute global domination. It is estimated to cost at least $1 trillion. That means we need to pony up. Even though the Cold War is over, we've got to give more money to the military. How do you get the American people ready to pony up? Well, in 2000, this group called the Project for the New American Century that had Rumsfeld, Cheney, Pearl, Wolfowitz, all sorts of people, many of whom became central members of the Bush II administration, were members of this organization. They put out a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And in there they say we need to do this rapid transformation of the military. But it's going to go very slowly, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, such as the new Pearl Harbor. The evening of 9/11, evidently Bush wrote in his diary, I think the new Pearl Harbor happened, of the 21st century happened today. After 9/11, Rice, Cheney, Bush were all going around saying, this 9/11 provides great opportunities for us. No mention of that, the word opportunity. There's in the 9/11 report, there's an index. You go on internet and look up any word. Look up opportunities. You will not find opportunities in the mouth of any member of the administration. Iraq, no mention of the fact that this same group had been chomping at the bit to attack Iraq ever since Papa Bush wouldn't do it back in 91. They were very upset with him. In the report, no mention that we might have some interest in the oil. Now, Kerry, the other night, in my moment, the proudest moment, he said, what happened when we went to Iraq? We ignored everything. Everything was chaos, except the oil ministries. We protected the oil ministries. Furthermore, he said, we're building 14 military bases. If you read Chalmers Johnson's book, that's what it's all about. Oil and bases are two sides of the same coin. That's what it's about. You would not get an inkling of that. We were just going over to take care of Saddam because he was a bad man. Okay, I'll have to draw this to an end. Let me just say that when my book comes out in 6 weeks, the second part of the book, which is dealing with the 9/11 report, defending the military, going through Flight 11, 175, 77, and then 93. This is by far, every reader reads it and says, this is the strongest part of the book. And I'm sorry I didn't get to it today, but then I want you to buy my book. But when you get to this part, you will say, part 1 is mild, compares with the lies in part 2. Let me just give one example. The big question is, did we shoot down, did we, our own military, shoot down Flight 93? And many people have argued Cheney was down in the underground shelter masterminding this operation. What does the 9/11 report do? It tells you, well, Cheney didn't get down there till 10 o'clock. And then the flight was down at 10:03. No way he could have done it. And then he didn't give the shoot-down order till 10:15, 10:10, 10:15. Norman Mineta, Secretary of Transportation, testified to the 9/11 Commission that he got to the White House about 9:15, checked in with Richard Clark. This corresponds exactly to Richard Clark, what he says in his book, Against All Enemies. Went down to the underground shelter, got there by 9:20. Cheney was already there, was clearly in charge. There was a guy coming in talking about this flight is 50 miles out. Does this order stand? This was probably whatever was coming towards the Pentagon, which in the book they tell you, gee, we didn't know anything about it until 2 minutes ahead of time. And here we have it, almost 20 minutes ahead of time. And so they make up this story that Cheney didn't get taken down to the underground shelter and didn't actually get in there till 10 o'clock. So they lie by probably, Richard Clark's account suggests that Cheney went down about 9:12. So they lie by almost an hour there. And they tell you, well, this was in the logs, but the Secret Service says, well, those logs somehow got destroyed. We don't have that information, but you know, we can trust the Secret Service. So the biggest lies are in part 2, particularly with regard. Well, let me summarize. You've got 3 stories. You now had 3 stories about 9/11. The first few days after 9/11, Myers, NORAD, and others were saying, we didn't send up any flights until after the Pentagon was hit. Well, that wasn't going to wash. That looks like a stand down where you say, well, just let it happen. So then they start telling us, and CBS says on Tuesday night, oh no, they sent up flights, but they just didn't get there on time. And that became official then on September 18th. They came out with their timeline. They said, here's when the FAA told us, and here's when we scrambled airplanes, and unfortunately they just couldn't get there in time. Now, then in the meantime, critics have looked at those timelines and said, you still could have made it. You could have stopped Flight 175. You certainly could have stopped Flight 77, assuming it was. And so we've got a third story here. They give us a new timeline which says we had 9 minutes notice for Flight 11, and that wasn't enough because it took 8 minutes for NEADS, NORAD in Northeast, to call Florida to get permission to send up planes, which is, you know, ridiculous. An 8-minute phone call when you've got a crisis. And then no warning whatsoever. So they tell you that what we've been told since September 18th is all false. When September 18th, NORAD's timeline said we got a notification of Flight 175 at 8:43, the 9/11 Commission says, no, that was a mistake. They didn't know about it until the South Tower was hit. And then Flight 77, they said, well, we got notification at 9:24. No notification. We only heard about it 2 minutes ahead of time, just in time to send up a guy and look at it and say, yeah, that's a Boeing 757, all right, just before it crashed. And then with Flight 93, no warning whatsoever. So just a complete rewriting of history. And revisionism is fine, but you've got to show why the old story was false and why the new story is more credible. They don't do that. They just say, that was incorrect. That was incorrect. Here's the truth, and then you look at the notes. It looks very scholarly because they've got all these books and the notes in the back, but you look at the crucial ones, and it says, interview with General Myers, interview with General Everhart, interview with the Secret Service, interview with the FBI agents. I hate to tell you this, but this is the sad story of truth and politics in Washington in these here days. Thank you very much.